Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
Eli couldn't be here today due to movie viewing conflicts, but today we are digging into Megalopolis, the 2024 epic science fiction drama written, directed, and produced by Francis Ford Coppola's Vineyards, as well as Francis Ford Coppola himself. And joining us by the graces of social media and kismet, perhaps, is Dr. Hannah Čulík-Baird, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of California, Los Angeles, co-editor of the journal Race to Ficales, and an unrepentant, by her own admission, an unrepentant Adam Driver stan. Welcome, Hannah. Glad to have you on the show.
Thank you so much to you both for giving me an outlet for whatever this feeling I have.
It's really, it's me. I needed an outlet, and then Christy was like,
I got dragged
else.
into it.
Yes. Because anyways, we'll start with our guest, because like I said, this meeting was spurred by a blog post you wrote, Hannah, that's sort of, laying out your thoughts. But in a word, do you dig Megalopolis?
No. But it's not so simple as we'll get into.
It's not. I will give you that.
That's not to say that I didn't. Okay, so I didn't enjoy watching it. I didn't think it was coherent. I didn't think even the part that drew me to it, which was the Adam Driver portion, in addition to the Cicero stuff, was actually quite minimal. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. But did it fill me with like a weird euphoria? Like, yeah. Like afterwards, I couldn't stop talking about it for 48 hours. It just made me feel something that unlike anything I've ever felt before, which is mostly disgust. But also lots of other things that we can unpack, and let's just get into it, I guess,
Yeah, it filled you with megalon, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Christy, how about you? I know you were sort of brought here kicking and screaming.
I was. Let me set the scene for you. So I'm in charge of our social media for the podcast, and I see this post for this movie called Megalopolis, and lo and behold, it's Hannah's review. And I'm going to quote part of this review because this is the part that got my attention. People left our screening within the first 15 minutes. One man who did stay at the end fell asleep face down across 3 theater seats. Incidentally, very few people are seeing this film. It cost $140 million to make and had grossed $4 million in its opening weekend. Coppola sold his wineries for this. It's incoherent and, yes, feverish, gaudy, tacky, and somehow both over and underwritten, as well as over and underacted. It's often quite unpleasant to watch. So that is all of the information I have about this movie. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to bring this up at our next podcast meeting because I don't want to. And not like even 3 hours later, Colin texts, who's like, we got to cover Megalopolis. I'm like, no. But then I saw Hannah's follow-up post of like, if there's any podcast or anyone who wants to sit down and unpack this more, and I'm like, it's just all going to come together, isn't it? I'm going to have to see this movie and cover it. And
this is fate, right?
This is fate. And so, yes, kicking and screaming, I found myself at a theater that served alcohol because that was the only way I was going to do it. And I watched it, and I did not dig it. So what I have told people, what it felt like to me was going into certain philosophy classes where I don't care about the topic, but I still have to think about it very deeply the entire time. So my brain hurts from trying to extract meaning from something that I don't actually care about because I'm an overachiever and that's what I do. And it's been a long time since I felt like I was in a philosophy course, and this movie did it to me. So that's where I'm at. I have more thoughts I'm sure we'll go on, but Colin.
Yeah.
Not a fan of you right now.
That's fine. I was willing to just go solo on this one and just scream into a microphone for an hour and a half about all my rambling thoughts, but I'm glad I have you two here to sort of temper me. So, because let me back up and I will sort of similarly say, like, I dig the idea of this movie and I dig talking about it and thinking about this movie. The movie itself is admittedly, as you've both said, a bit of a struggle to watch. It's a little hard to watch for reasons we can unpack. But to have the other side of that story Christy told, I teaching at Smith College, and we have a tradition called Mountain Day, where once in the fall, the president on a random day rings the bell and classes are canceled, and the students go out and then do activities, and everybody just has the day off. And so it was Mountain Day, and I decided instead of working that I would go for a hike. And so I was hiking up Mount Tom in Holyoke, and I was listening to a podcast reviewing movies, not our own. And they were talking about Megalopolis that had just come out. And as I was listening to their conversation, I'm like, well, we absolutely have to talk about this movie, because even though I had sort of vaguely heard of the film, I think for some reason I got it in my head that it was like a remake of like Metropolis or
Mhm.
something like that. Like I didn't know what it was. And then when I found out what it actually was, which is a very convoluted allegory for the Catalanarian conspiracies, and by Francis Ford Coppola, I like immediately got on. I immediately started group texting Christine Eli and was like, we can't not talk about this. And why didn't we think about this sooner? But broadly, yeah, I have all sorts of notes that I took immediately, like after I left the screening, of which we can get all these sort of questions. But my main one that I have my notes divided into major and minor points, but this one is in minor, but maybe should be move up, which is, did Elon Musk ghostwrite this film?
Uh, mm, Reasonable question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we can sort of get into it and to contextualize the film a little bit for listeners. It is a story that is a allegory, we'll say, of late Republic Rome set in New York, America, detailing the conflict between Caesar Catalina, played by Adam Driver, this brilliant inventor trying to create a utopian city, and his ideological and political rival, Franklin Cicero, played by Giancarlo Esposito. And if I try to describe the plot any more than that, I think I might go insane. But
Yeah, good luck.
That was a good summarization, I will say, overall.
yes, there's a lot going on. But I guess we can start first with the thing that brought us here originally, which is the Rome-ness of it all.
Mhm.
Because Coppola sort of, this movie has been long germinating in his brain. He conceived it as an allegory for the decline and fall of the United States in 1980, as a Roman allegory for the Catalanarian conspiracies and Rome's turn from republic to empire.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This
what do we think of that?
this film was it's like, do you even think about the Roman Empire? And Francis Ford Coppola's answer was like, "Oh, hell yeah, I do. Here you go." Yeah, Hannah, go ahead. What were your thoughts on that?
I mean, these are okay. These are good questions to get out the way in terms of the responsibility that we have as classicists within the profession to establish a baseline in terms of classical reception, right, for this film, which is to, like
Mhm.
the Romaness. And I think the Romaness is the perfect way to describe this because there are texts that Francis Ford Coppola has said that he read, right? You know, he talked about Cicero and Sallust. There are the subsequent moralization that the Catalanarian conspiracy had within like a European tradition is also something that I think he's aware of generally. But the Romaness is very troubling to me because essentially what it feels like is that Francis Ford Coppola has seen a lot of stagings of Rome as part of classic cinema, and then now he believes that it to be like inherently part of the DNA of film, and that therefore it has something to do with the classical nature of film itself and cinema itself. And not to like jump ahead too much, but there is that scene where Franklin Cicero says, "Oh, hey, my name is really Francis," um,
Mhm.
and it's like, "Oh, okay, Francis, this is how you see yourself, as inserting yourself into the narrative." But the Romaness is very the actual kind of coherence of it. Well, I mean, it is quite incoherent, but there are distributed natures of Romaness throughout the film. So the part that is kind of ostensibly it restages the Catalanarian conspiracy, although it takes quite it's quite at an arm's length from it, and I have no problem with that. I think that that's actually quite an important space in terms of the agency of classical reception to be able to carve out, you know, critical distance in various ways. But there's the costumery, which I think is probably something that we could talk a lot about. It's a little bit like Caesar's Palace kind of Rome style stuff, right? Kind of
Mhm.
Mhm.
understanding some of the components and then making it stand for the culture rather than necessarily being reflective of that culture, which again, I have no problem with in terms of, let's say, restaging imaginatively. There's the fact that Adam Driver has a kind of Julio Claudian haircut, which does not suit him. And the whole reason to go and see an Adam Driver film is for him to have long, luscious locks. I think that's actually part of the critical failure of this film, is that he doesn't suit this Julio Claudian haircut.
Yeah.
And then
And it's like it develops, because I remember at a certain point, like late in the movie, he's got the exact, like the bangs are like pincered in
Yeah.
just such a way, so it's like identical to like a statue you would see of Caesar or something like that.
Yeah, precisely. But then there's the fact that New York is taken to be the new Rome, and that's very overt, right? But it's also not very easily coherent, because you have these characters who are, you know, dressed and staged in various ways against a backdrop of actually just contemporary New York, and it seems that's the part that makes the least aesthetic sense to me. And also it and this is something I wrote about in that blog post, is that it's just a very hackneyed trope, the idea that America is Rome. I mean, we can talk about very seriously the ways in which the US deliberately self-fashioned along the lines of Rome, often appropriating Rome for, you know, white supremacist means. But that's why it feels very like naive and at the same time uncritical to put Rome in New York and then simply to restage this as if it were completely natural, and like there's nothing even to question about it, right? And so this gets to the question of translatio imperii, the fact that America, the belief that America is the new Rome. And that is something that I wonder about with Francis Ford Coppola, is that this is a very uncritical position to have, and his film could have, you know, critically thought about this premise in multiple ways, but it just fails to at every opportunity.
Yeah.
So, and then of course we can say more about the fact that like the Catilinarians are directly quoted. There are quotations from Catullus and other classical sources. But the ways in which the Romeness is like uncomfortably like placed upon a veneer on top of a kind of gaudy artifact that is filtered through a lot of different kinds of influences.
Yeah. And it's not like that sort of critique of especially setting New Rome in New York hasn't existed, because Rick Riordan, who set Percy Jackson by having the gods move Olympus to the Empire State Building in New York, and he got called out for that, of like just not being critical of the history. And I think it's interesting because like the other line that really stands out, especially because it's one of the first instances you see Adam Driver's character, is he's quoting Shakespeare. And so that's making this connection that exists between Rome and England and the United States as being the inheritors of this cultural history in some
Yeah.
ways.
This film has an obsession with great men and also Sappho, where it's so much of it is like quoting all of these famous, you know, Shakespeare and Catullus and you know, Voltaire or whatever, and then we get a Sappho quote in as like a kernel of representation or something.
There's also, so the way that I learned about this film was Francis Ford Coppola had a Instagram post about a year ago where he posted a set of screenshots of his influences. And one of them, would you mind if I read this?
Go for it.
Absolutely, shoot it.
Which actually gets to a lot of this, right? It's not directly about Rome, but it gets to the civilizational argument which this film is trying to make. To see where I'm coming from, please understand that our family, Homo sapiens, has been around for 350,000 years. There is much evidence that the last 10,000 years have been under patriarchy, parenthesis, male domination, due to male animal herders from steppes of Asia and the advent of, in quotes, the horse. With that unfortunate innovation, men swooped down like something out of a Kurosawa movie and began women enslavement, in particular slavery, war, caste, plague, and many things we all should agree are terrible. Also, quote, man, unquote, began writing, usually out of the need to make a record of who was entitled to bags of barley and matrimony of various types, to ensure our heirs were actually our children. Before this period of so-called civilization were thousands of years of matriarchy. Unlike patriarchy, women did not necessarily give out orders, but rather things were settled in egalitarian councils led by women, and often with a wise woman giving perspective. Okay. So...
Oof.
A lot to unpack there.
So this is really fun to think about because of the fact that I think that he thinks that he was saying something really profound with this film, which he doesn't. I think that's fundamentally the failure, is that he does not say anything profound. And in fact, most of what is really egregious about the film in terms of its Romeness is how it repeats tropes that are, like, in their origin, have something to do with, let's say, like a Suetonian, critique of debauchery within the imperial household or something. It has that kind of vibe of like adaptations of I, Claudius. It has this kind of like a stage playness to it, but he's not saying anything profound while taking in and thinking about these kinds of civilizationist discourses that account for humanity as a whole. And he's struggling here to try to like onboard some kind of feminist consciousness, but it's really, really clunky, right? And I hope that we will talk about representations of female characters in this, which is
we are
particularly
going to.
Yes.
Trust me, that is my bread and butter right there.
We would be remiss if we didn't. But like exactly to your point, I wrote in my notes that this film, it's doing one of my least favorite things that films do, which is act like it's being profound when it actually isn't. And it also is kind of one sort of becoming a metaphor for itself of like this, or like very much Francis Ford Coppola feels like this beleaguered auteur, like struggling to birth his utopian vision of the future into reality that's going to make all of our lives better, and just getting feedback from it. And then I also feel like this podcast is becoming a metaphor for the movie, because I'm just like struggling to like tie all these themes together and make any sense of it. I'm going to like also descend into incoherent madness. But to your point, the like, yeah, like there's all sorts of problems of like layering the Rome on a very thin veneer on top, or like one, it kind of just makes very little sense that like there's like the Empire, not the Chrysler Building and Grand Central Station exist exactly as they exist. Voltaire apparently lived, and all these other famous people. Like history was unchanged, but also New York is Rome, and like what is that even doing? The answer is very little. And see, I'm fulfilling my own prophecy, but the idea of like it's simultaneously too abstract and also too specific. Like it seems to think it has something very specific to say about America at this exact moment and Rome at that exact moment, but everything of like what the Megalon is, what the utopia actually is going to look like, what are these actual, like what is anybody's platform on anything aside from like we should learn better. It's too vague to have any.
Like, no, literally, what is a Megalon? Like, what is it?
It's everything.
Like,
Is that the metal that
yeah,
is being used to build structures and make see-through clothing and reconstruct a face? Like,
yes, it can make a invisible dress. It can reconstruct Adam Driver's face. It can make smart shape-shifting buildings.
But I just wanted to thank you for mentioning that thing about his face being reconstructed, because as we talked about off mic, like I haven't been able to see this film for a second time because it bombed so badly that we are now going to have to reconstruct this film through our memories of it. And I had suppressed that. Indeed. I think that the worst stuff in this film happens right at the end, and so I basically suppressed that whole part which is where he has his face reconstructed. But anyway, yeah, the Megalon, which there's so much to say, and what even is it? But I mean, again, not too much of a metaphor for the film, but there's never any instinct or attempt to define what the Megalon is.
Nope.
Yeah. And the sort of the simple point that I was taking a very long road to work to is basically like the film's ultimate, or one of its main failures, like Annie just mentions, that it feels like it's being very progressive, but it's in fact quite retrograde. And I think this all comes back to the fact that Coppola started thinking about this film in the late 80s. And I wonder if this film actually had come out in like 1992 or something like that, would we have reacted very differently to it? Versus it comes out in 2024 and feels like in many ways like a sort of a relic of a bygone era.
So what's interesting about that, as Adam Driver scholar, is that Adam Driver was also in a similarly epic filled film, which was also long and had a fraught production history, which is The Man Who Killed Don Quixote from 2018, directed by Terry Gilliam. And it is interesting to think about, even for me, who again have come to this with Cicero, but also the Adam Driver interest. This is why it's been a very strange experience to watch this film because of those two things coming together. But the in terms of Adam Driver's filmography, the directors have been really drawn to him because of this
Hmm.
belief in being like the original man, which is a quote from Girls, because his character there is also called Adam,
Mhm.
is that they see in him something civilizational, and they keep trying to cast him in this role of a figure who is at the heart of an epic film that begins out of a consciousness that is decades old, and then by the time it sees the light of day, it's incoherent and very politically iffy. Like Terry Gilliam's or political message in that film is like heinous. Essentially, it's actually quite embarrassing. Bush era kind of politics.
Mhm.
But then Adam
Hmm.
Driver continues to be cast in these kinds of roles where the purpose of the film is to have him be a kind of unsettling figure. And I think he actually likes to be a very disgusting kind of figure for that reason. Like conceptually, like challenging. The figure that he plays in that film is a little bit that way, but the one that is particularly challenging is Annette from 2021, where he's also a kind of genius figure, but a murderer, spoiler alert, with a very disgusting baby doll. It's a doll that is playing his baby. It really,
Mm.
that film really also rubs me the wrong way in every conceivable way. So the fact that Adam Driver is in this film that is about civilizational optimism with a very naive development, cast onto him as like the Man, as a civilizational conqueror who will use his intellect to cure the society of all ills, is something that people keep trying to write onto him. I think also his role in White Noise is a similar kind of thing of like understanding that he's the only one at the center of civilization who can really see the truth and can figure it out. And I just find this fascinating to like, what are we reacting to about Adam Driver that he is going to be this kind of figure that we put in our failed epics?
I have a theory, but we
Oh,
may reject it on the premise. But it's our, I guess, uncomfortableness with how attracted we are to Adam Driver in a way that I think one of the reasons he's so popular with filmmakers is that he is simultaneously, I think, very compelling and arresting and like arguably quite sexy, but he's also very non-conventional if you think of like Hollywood leading men and like what their faces look like and their bodies. And he's like not that, but there's also something like inescapably arresting about Adam Driver and his face, his physique, his mannerisms, his intensity. I think that's not fully an answer, but I think it's basically like we need to come to terms with how attracted we are to Adam Driver.
Okay,
But
I just have to, like, state that I am in no way attracted to this man. I feel like the only other film I've seen him in is the Star Wars reboot as Kylo Ren, and I just he does not do it for me in any regard, and I saved this aside for you, Colin, but, like, I also had a strong feeling, it's like, I know Francis Ford Coppola is the big name in film. Has Christy watched any of his films before this one? And the answer is nope. I've seen some that he produced, but not directed. And if you remember, if you guys have seen White Lotus season 2, I know Colin has because we've talked about it.
have to,
There's
yeah.
that whole scene where they're in Sicily where the car exploding goes off and they're having a conversation with the 3 men about, like, how the grandpa and the father are like, "It's the best American film ever," and then the son is just like, "Well, actually, it's you guys like that movie because it's of a bygone era where men could kinda do what they want, and that was just how they and the wife would wait at home dutifully, and ironically enough, that was the season, Aubrey Plaza was in, and then she ends up in this for,
I
like,
know.
the very same thing, and it's like, that's kind of stuck with me is that was my feeling with Coppola's work, especially looking at the female characters. I think it's somewhere in my notes I wrote at some point that, like, men get to be the geniuses in this world and women get to be the muse, right? And, like, it's just so done. Like, we've watched a lot of stuff on Rome, television and films, and, like, I want us to come beyond that and see characters, like, come out of these tropes that have existed as part of this imagined Rome for so long, and
Mhm.
it felt like everything else about the film was trying to be really distracting from that because visually, yeah, it's really interesting to watch and think about. Then you get super confused with the megalon, but also the artistic ability to stop time.
Oh
oh,
god,
we
it
haven't
doesn't.
even mentioned that.
That's what happened in the blog post. Was like, wait, I forgot this.
Yeah.
How did this not come up until the very end? Yeah.
And
Hmm.
it feels like definitely, like, it was partly, like, Coppola wanting to get all his ideas out in this maybe one last big hurrah for him, which and it definitely comes across like that's what happened. But it also feels like it's just trying to appear cutting edge that all it does is distract from the fact that, like, this is such an old, unoriginal portrayal of Rome. Like, I've seen it so many times if I break and I think that's where the thinking really hard is like, I'm trying to see this in a new light. I'm really trying, and it's not. It's just not, and I think that's what was frustrating is, like, I was hoping for something different, and it just wasn't actually, even if visually it seemed like it could be.
It speaks to, well, I don't want to forget about Colin's point, very important point, which is that Adam Driver is hot, and that's the
That's
reason
fair,
why
that's
this
fair,
is
that's all you
happening.
guys.
I
That's
mean that
that's the sound bite.
yes. Well, I think that I just want to affirm this theory because I do think that the reason why he has managed to sustain the attention of the public for this long is because he is attractive, but he's unconventional, and he also has a physicality that we find kind of compelling in some way. And I don't even know that I think at this point that he is particularly a good actor, but I still find him to be an engaging performer. And another thing, as again, Adam Driver scholar, is that he comes from a theatrical background, and it's clear that he prefers performances that allow him to feel like he's in a play. And sometimes
Mhm.
there is a play in the thing that he's doing, and he likes that kind of theatrical aspect. But more importantly, actually, Christy, regarding the representation of women, oh God! I mean, to be honest, ancient representations of women are much richer and interesting than whatever is going on in this film, because it's
Yeah.
worse than a parody of itself. It really it's like egregious. It's insulting the way that the women act in this. I don't even understand. Like they are acting like a maniac the whole time. Everyone is just like on turn up to 11. The way that the plot resolves with Wow Platinum, which is the name of Audrey Plaza's character, is
Mhm.
honestly just I feel sorry for everyone involved, right?
Yeah.
And I really think that this is something you're right to basically draw attention to the fact that one of the things that we struggle with this film is when you go is that tastes have moved on so much that you get these kinds of artifacts of Francis Ford Coppola's own oeuvre, which we like maybe found to be contextually tolerable in his classics, which now just seem completely tone deaf and unnatural. I think that that's actually part of it is that everyone was forced to behave unnaturally in this film. Like there was no
Yeah.
naturalistic performances. There was no like depth coming from the characters. Oh my god. I was just remembering that there's like this kind of invitation of a blowjob scene between the two of them in the beginning, and there was something really. I wish I could remember the dialogue at that point. This is why this is like a lost text that we're reconstructing through our memories. I just remember it being just like so on the razor's edge of well, not even. It was just like insulting and to the kind of broader kind of cultural outlook, which should make us review. We should go back through the oeuvre now and like see what we had been accepting in the past, right?
Oh, yeah.
Lady Gaga and the House of Gucci had a better kind of turn alongside Adam Driver, but I don't know. There was still some kind of tension there in terms of over the top kind of 2D kind of performances.
Yeah.
Did remind me of something of what Wow Platinum was doing.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say, even like Chrissy, to your point, like I would argue that I Claudius, which is maybe by no means a feminist text, had better like realized women in its, back in the late 70s. But there's
Yeah.
basically two women in this film.
Hmm.
There's Julia, played by Natalie Emmanuel, who is the dutiful wife who recognizes Adam Driver's genius
Uh-huh.
and is just ride or die for that and
But she starts
proves,
off as super promiscuous, like, that is literally what
yes.
Oh,
the movie opens
go back to
with.
the
Yeah,
club.
she's like a rich party girl.
So go back to the club.
Yeah.
Yeah, the club, yes, of course. Um, Oh, no, but I was gonna say you basically have like a virgin horror dichotomy. Like you have Natalie Emmanuel, and then across from her you have Wow Platinum, who's an oversexed gold digger.
Mhm.
In maybe the most fun performance, I guess. Like, and
Yeah.
maybe I hope she had fun filming this.
For
But
her, but not fun to watch. I didn't find it fun to watch.
yeah,
No.
yeah.
Well, there is one more character, and it's Vesta,
Yeah.
Oh,
and
right.
I'm not
Okay,
And the
so
dead
the
wife.
dead wife.
and the dead wife.
Yeah. And I wrote down in my notes, apparently the most attractive thing a man can be is in love with his dead wife, because that's what puts Julia over for him, is seeing him mourn his wife. But
Mhm.
Chrissy, you're gonna say something about Vesta.
So with Vesta, like, so we've been making fun of the see-through dress, but it's like, "Oh, look at this." It's like, you can see right through me, and she's a pop star at this point, right? And I'm like, what are we trying to say about young female ingenue singers if we're doing that? And you can see right through me. And then when it's revealed, because her like whole thing was her virginity, and when it's revealed, even though like Catalina wasn't the one who slept with her, it revealed she wasn't a virgin. You see later in like a news brief that she's gone bad girl, and so she like takes on the Miley Cyrus like after Disney kind of stage of things, which again is also she and Britney Spears, and like they have actually come a long way since then, and it's so there was things like that. There was also another line that didn't have to do with Vesta, but it, like, bugged me so much. I can't even remember. I think it was, like, Claudio and Catalina was saying these things to each other, and the question was, "Do you prefer girls? Who doesn't prefer girls?"
Yes,
And I'm
it's in
like
the red carpet.
Uh,
and I'm like, "Ew, ew. Why?"
yeah, and also I find Shia LaBeouf's presence is very sinister, right, against whom there are
I was about to
Mhm.
say,
credible accusations. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, Claudio Pulcher is, I think, the actually best. Please put this as many scare quotes as possible. Best part of this film because of the fact that he actually. Let's take Shia LaBeouf out of it, but the character gets at something real about the late Republican period that we can relate to, which is the a performance of gender in these kinds of ways that aligns also with male aggression. And like the
Yeah.
wish it were a different actor, because if it were a different actor and it also you could somehow salvage some scenes from this to show people, it would go very well with, let's say, Catullus's poems of sexual aggression and performance of gender fluidity in various contexts. And so it was, but then it's Shia LaBeouf, who is a problematic figure and also problematizes this positionality even further. And it gets aligned with the popularist vote in the end. This is how he gets his kind of comeuppance at the end, which is also too optimistic to think that popularism is just going to resolve itself like this by self destruction. That's way
Yeah.
too naive, right? But I thought that that is the
Mhm.
part of the film where I thought, okay, this was actually something interesting in here that's actually understanding the source material in an interesting way, but it's deeply undercut by the casting, and then of course many other things. By the way, the name of the Catalina's wife is Sunny Hope. Sunny Hope Catalina.
Sunny Hope.
Doesn't that make you feel insane?
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I read so Coppola did, like, an Ask Me Anything on Twitter not long after like, I think between when you posted your review and a few days later I went and saw the film, he posted his responses to an Ask Me Anything, and, like, someone asked him, was like, "How'd you come up with the name Wow Platinum?" And the story for it is so weird of just like, "I just met this lady and her name was Wow, and I thought, 'Wow.'" And you're like so that is the story. I
Good
can't remember
story,
if it was
frankly.
WoW or Platinum. I think it might have been Platinum too, but it was so I was just like, "Alright." And, like, some of his responses to other questions were a little bit more deep thinking, and then but then some of his answers were like that, and I'm like, "I do I wanna meet this man? Do I wanna talk to him?" I feel like it'd be a very interesting conversation at the end of the day.
But this is a wonderful anecdote, which is I met a woman called Wow, and I thought, wow, like that's
Yeah.
wonderful.
I will post the actual thing because 'cause I'm sure I'm misquoting it slightly, but I just found it so ridiculous that but that's how he came up with that character's name, and yeah, I also the interesting thing about Shia LaBeouf, I didn't even realize it was him for a while.
Mhm.
I was kind of tracking the Claudio character because you need the first, I don't know, half hour to, like, pin everyone down and who they are, and
And even
I
like what's real.
remember I remember Claudio dressed up at the Vesta concert thing,
Mhm.
and I'm like, "Okay, that's some really beautiful cross" like, of all of the people and how they're dressed, that person looks the best, like, that outfit was killing.
That was I agree.
But then my question becomes, like, especially when you saw who was acting as Claudio, And eventually, yeah, what was Claudio's outcome? Is like, but is this just like a nicer packaged demonization of cross-dressing individuals? Like, I understand that Claudio does have historical connection to cross-dressing as part of like some of the historical facts we're given, but like conveniently placed in a film like this that has its own historical
Yeah, and
problems.
to stack on that, the incest allegations, like in the movie, which is again like pulling, if I recall correctly, from allegations about the historical Claudius Poker. But every time Claudio comes out, some newsman or something, it's like, oh, I heard he's sleeping with his sisters, and this like Christy says, like in the film itself, this kind of connection between like the way gender is performed with that character, the way it's sort of intertwined inexorably with like sexual deviance and also just regular political deviance. And you know, when later he's giving his stump speech on like a literal swastika stump. Yeah, that it becomes kind of icky, and like this is our one possibly like not straight character, and this is what it is.
This is what I mean is that like there's the bones of something quite interesting in this that then goes off the rails completely. And it's true that you want to be in a climate where drag performances are politicized and in fact criminalized. It's opportunity to get things right. In fact, obligation to get things right. And also there is like a kernel of this where it's a teachable moment to be able to discuss through someone like Claudius or again like Catullus how masculinity is constructed in antiquity and how it does partake in gendered fluidity in some contexts, and there's a performative role to it, but that they also are aggressive, historical actors in various ways, and to unpack what an incest allegation means in antiquity, which there's a rhetorical system that supports it. So there, in a way, if you have any kind of familiarity with like the beats of the Catilinarian conspiracy, these moments are the ones where you're supposed to light up and say, "Oh, I get that that's a referent to historical text or what have you." But one of the things that I think is actually quite confusing is that it isn't legible on its own terms, and in the way in which it is legible on its own terms, it can only be put towards malicious use. Right? It's like if you don't understand that the performance of Claudio Pulcher in this film in different contexts is supposed to be a reference to the kind of careful performativity that the historical referent had in terms of his control in different contexts of mass and private, politics, then you will just read into this character like woke politics in the worst way. Like it can really invite a very ungracious interpretation.
I totally forgot that. So I went to the theater by myself, and like while I was waiting, I was texting Colin and Lige, and I was like looking around me. It's like I am literally the only person who is not a guy with a guy friend here watching this movie. And Colin you sent me that wonderful meme of like the two massive arms clasping hands, and one's like film bros and Rome bros. And I'm like, that is exactly what is happening here. And I barely, as like a Roman archaeologist, I look at later periods, but it's like I barely knew anything about this particular historical event. So if you don't know who Claudio is, then the more general cultural knowledge people have coming to the film are cross-dressing guy, kind of evil, and oh good, he died at the end.
Oh yeah, and of course
that is going to be the takeaway.
queer-coded character is the villain. Got it.
Yeah, it all comes back to like we're coming back around to like the allegory of it all. We're like, one of my great hangups about allegory stories is they really ride or die, and like, well, they rely entirely on familiarity with the thing they're allegorizing, and that's where this movie really falls apart, because like we've been saying, like it's not internally coherent or logical. It relies on this outside reference point, but also its mirroring of the outside reference point is also kind of weird, and it's oddly specific in some ways, like everything we just said about Claudio, but then also very loosey-goosey in many other ways. And like I think just the fact that Adam Driver's character is named Caesar Catalina, and I'm like, is he supposed to be Cataline? Is he supposed to be Caesar? Is he supposed to be both? Is that saying something? Like, I don't know.
It's I think part of the reason that this failed, there are many reasons, but one is that the fact that he was called Caesar Catalina because it confused general audiences about what Caesar's role in this was. And this is an example of Francis Ford Coppola actually being somewhat smart in the sense that he has understood that Catiline, as a conspiratorial figure, prefigured Julius Caesar's social reforms in terms of just the social history of the era. And they have that is true. That is a true thing about that era. But it is harder. Then what happens though is that Julius Caesar's identity has been kind of broken up and then transferred to various characters. So this Cicero's daughter, who like the daughter historically is called Tullia, is called Julia.
Yep.
And that means that, there's this kind of lurking residue of Caesarian politics that is not manifested. And on the one hand, like that's quite interesting, but it is too confusing with everything else going on. If you had everything pared down more so you could focus on this, then you might be able to actually do it. Like, Christy, you mentioned before about the pop star, the kind of mirroring these pop star trajectories. And I'm so like, I did not pick up on that at all because there was too much to focus on. And I'm really like, now I'm like seeing this in like, that's actually also a sensitive idea, kind of badly executed, but it's just completely lost in the soup. And I also want to, before, I wanted to say, like, Jason Schwartzman is in this movie, right? Who obviously is part of the Coppola family.
Yes.
Right? There's a scene where he's just playing the drum set because he was in Phantom Planet as a drummer. And it seems to be that this is just a little homage, like just a reference to Jason Schwartzman's career that I don't know who could have originated this idea, but that if you don't know that Jason Schwartzman was in Phantom Planet, then you're like, why is Jason Schwartzman playing the drums right now? Right? And so it does, but this actually does elicit like a reasonably complex conversation about what classical knowledge and classicism and the ability to catch reference means. But it's an example of how if you have too much stuff going on, no one's going to be able to understand it and it becomes incoherent. So there are strands of like almost thoughtfulness, but it's completely confused to the degree that it can't be like teased out.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we've had something similar with names that have this classical hearkening and that you could try and find historical significance in, but you're never quite sure if it translates on the character. And that was the Hunger Games. Like Susan Collins named a lot of her characters classically inspired names with actual historical figures. And I think we did that for the prequel movie. We're like, what does the fact that this character has this name and what his storyline looks like does that in any way translate? Or it's like, or are we just trying to put meaning there because it's somehow familiar to us?
Yeah.
I was talking about this film to a colleague of mine, and we were kind of talking about this exact sort of thing of like, is it a reference for reference's sake? Is it a reference that leads nowhere? Is it a reference that promises meaning but actually dead ends in a dark alley? And we were talking, and he was pitching me, he's like, is this an example of dead intertext where it's like, clearly there's an intertext happening, but it just brick walls, right? It just hits a dead end and actually doesn't, right? We can see there's clearly a reference to the Catilinarian conspiracies, although that sort of falls apart. There's traces of these echoes from history or literature or film and television even, but like none of it necessarily hangs or points in any particular way towards any sort of semblance of meaning. But yeah.
I think that, there are so many examples of heavily, nutrient-rich intertextual artwork where you actually could not know any of the references and still appreciate there is an aesthetic experience or an emotional experience or something. And then it may be through like your experience of that work that it leads you to the things that it's riffing on.
It's like Simpsons so many classics. I'll go on a rant. So many classic Simpsons episodes are parodies of famous films or televisions or novels. And as a kid, I knew none of that. And then you learn like, oh, this is a Cape Fear reference, or this is a reference to It's a Mad, Mad World or something like that. And you're like, but the jokes function in their respective episodes completely fine, even if you don't know, like they're riffing off this 60s movie or whatever it is.
And that's a great point because it is, comparable with the Francis Ford Coppola's kind of intent of gathering the best of his ideas and then placing it together, that it represents his decades of experience that are trying to cohere in some way, but end up pulling against one another. And I think one of the parts that he actually did lose sight of is the conspiratorial nature and the relationship between Caesar and Catiline, where he seems to have wanted to I've lost track of it now, but he did an interview where he basically said something along the lines of, I read I read the about the Catalanarian conspiracy, and I wanted to know what if Cicero were the bad guy. And then
Yes.
Yes.
he said something like this, and then that's not in the film. Cicero is absolutely
No.
not the bad guy. In fact, what happens is that through the miracle of heterosexuality, these two fighting people
You.
come together into one family, right? And that's what happens. Like, so I think he kind of lost sight of some of his ideas as he went into this. And then again, that
Yeah.
adds to this kind of argument that the Romaness of it is quite superficial.
Hmm.
Yeah, because I know at some point, I wrote it down again, it's like one of the lines thrown out that harkens back to the later, like, Augustan marriage laws and stuff. It's like marriage is, like, the one of the most important institutions.
Mhm.
But again, underlying that is the idea of, like, heterosexual,
Mhm.
childbearing marriages are the most important institution. Like, it doesn't deliberately come out and says that, but that's what it's modeling as
Mhm.
Yeah.
the most appropriate. Like, it comes to a happy ending, and I'm like,
That-
Bec-
well.
because they have a baby and everybody is on board with moving walkways.
yeah.
But
And that baby has time-stopping powers, and I don't know how you keep a baby like that safe.
God, I feel like you guys
Lord.
really understood this film more than I've forgotten everything about it. Can I just get back to this, like the an extension of the heterosexual miracle is that this is actually, I think I can make an argument for there being some kind of mediated reception here, because one of the interesting things about Cicero's first speech against Catiline, which is the probably the most famous one, and also one that has been read, that whole set of speeches has been read by students of Latin since antiquity. We have papyrus from a little bit later in Egypt, where it's a student whose first language seems to be Greek, who's making a word list from the Catalanarians into Greek, and it's like an example of how we've been tortured by Cicero for thousands of years. Anyway, in the first Catalanarian, Cicero takes a paternalistic stance towards Catiline in order to drive him out of the Senate house. But Catiline and Cicero were the same age, and the paternalism that is in this speech is Cicero deliberately, both, by the way, invoking his status as consul in that year, but also making an argument to present himself as a father to whom Catiline is being an unruly child, right? But they're the same age, actually, historically. But this stance that Cicero represents in this speech was then picked up subsequently by the rhetorical and literary and artistic tradition, to the degree that it results in, this is like that meme where there's like the little domino and then the big thing, right? It results in
Mhm.
yes.
this film where Cicero is the father figure and Catiline is the genius son, because
Mhm.
basically that's an assent to the premise of Ciceronian rhetoric, that he is actually an authoritarian figure in this situation. Whereas he was making that statement in order to make an argument, which actually also results in the fact that he wants to kill Catiline. That's what he says in this speech. And, Catilinarian conspirators were killed, and Catiline died in the field. So there is something really sinister about the fact that Cicero's rhetoric of patriarchal paternalistic rhetoric results in this sinister heterosexual miracle where, just by marrying these two men you can bring them together, right? But it is actually, I think,
Yeah.
has an ancient referent behind it.
I I like that. I really like that explanation because it brings up something that I also taught gender studies for a period of time, and one thing that I like pointing out to people is like when we say patriarchy, we don't actually mean rule by men. We mean rule by father.
Mhm.
So you can be a fully adult male in a patriarchal society, and you would still not have the same rights and hold the same amount of power as your father if he is still alive.
Mhm.
Spartacus played this up really well with Batiatus and like how he kept coming in constant conflict with his father, who literally had all the power to make decisions. And I think that goes back to Coppola's one thing I found problematic by saying it's like, well, it's a matriarchy, so it's a rule by women. It's like, again, matriarchy, if we're comparing it to a patriarchy, that same idea would be the rule by mother, but by that's already contested by saying it's egalitarian.
Yeah.
And I like clarifying that because it means that only a few choice individuals actually hold power. It's not half the population. It's even less than that.
The theory of matriarchy is a prior stage of civilizational development, attributes
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
primitivity to motherhood and to women in general. So like you can really see that quote that I about the invention of the horse that did this and that.
Mhm.
You can really see his completely undeveloped understanding of women and women's history and society at large in this belief that there is a pure aspect of society that is more primitive. And this is how
Mhm.
Cicero's daughter becomes just this glue figure. It speaks to this kind of primitive component of society, which is the family, wherein the women actually are harmonious, like structure, right? So it's very unsophisticated.
It is, and the only way that she successfully brings the family together is by getting pregnant and having a child,
Mhm. Mm,
by fulfilling the role of a woman to bear children for the family as a whole.
right,
Like,
right.
ugh,
It's real gross. It's real bad.
yeah. Um, for a quick side note, I found the quote. I was pulling up some of the different AMAs I shared. So this is the story of how we got WoW Platinum. It's pretty quick. I met a Southern young lady who told me her great grandmother was so beautiful that her name evolved as Wow. I asked if she had a picture of her. A while later, I heard back from her and she attached a photo of a painting. And when I looked at it, I said,
That's really mental.
Francis Ford Coppola creeps on my grandma.
Wow.
a
Wow.
painting of your grandma.
Wow. we should just cut in a bunch of Owen Wilsons, be like, wow.
I can pull that off.
My favorite.
Uh, I wonder for listeners who haven't seen the movie, is this going to make any goddamn sense, or who aren't familiar intimately with the Catalanarian conspiracies?
Yeah, because I do know one point I was gonna make earlier is, like, the only other time I remember Cicero being a prominent character within popular media was Rome,
Mm,
and that was way after these events had taken place.
mhm.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I we do end up, talking about audience a lot, and I don't know if that's the right question to ask because I don't think Coppola actually cared about audience in this case. Like, this felt and I guess this is an interesting question to ask of this felt like a very selfish project. It's for him, and that's fine. If he wants to sell his winery and do that and produce it,
Wineries.
I mean, yeah,
have at.
I was about to say, I think the one thing we probably can agree on is whatever this film's message is or isn't, it's very much a like the expression of Coppola's worldview,
Mhm.
such
Yeah.
as it is. And the one quote I singled out was the line like the thing I think the closest this film comes to articulating a thesis is I will not let time have dominion over my thoughts,
Mhm.
which just feels like the artist later in life thinking, right, I'm thinking about my legacy now, and I need to get it all out there, and I need to use my art to freeze time and enshrine my masterpiece.
Yeah.
And thus we get this movie about a guy trying to do exactly that.
Yeah. I mean, and it actually feels stupid to call it selfish because it's not made for an audience per se. Because, like, if it was made for an audience, he'd be trying to make money off of it, like a lot of money off of it, right? And this was very much for him. And I think that's an interesting question to think about. Is like I think we always tend to make an assumption when it comes to film or TV shows that like the goal is to make something for us to enjoy
Mhm.
and consume.
Mm.
And I think sometimes we forget that that is not always the intention from the creator, but then also it's like how privileged do you have to be as a creator to create something so expensive and not give any if it's going to make money on the back end of things if it's not well received.
It's really hard to know because while it does feel completely absorbed, it does feel like he's a sense of awareness of his mortality, and like that can only come with a longing for community in some form. And also, I think there are some title cards at the end that I don't remember what they say, but it says something like "to the future" or something.
It's like
Yeah.
yeah, it's like an alternate pledge of allegiance, right? It's like I pledge allegiance to the human race, or something
Yeah.
like that.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, which again, like a chill went through down my spine. I found all of the title cards throughout very chilling. Like
Yeah.
they came from a different era where like the I think that one thing that Francis Ford Coppola doesn't understand is that Roman art is already kind of imbued with a certain kind of fascist aesthetic, which is why it
Mhm.
gets adopted by Italian fascists. And so when he's using the iconography of this era in a modern context, it's for a hopeful message. It just comes across as like a neoconservative, revanchist argument. But
Mhm.
regarding the idea of the future is that there's something about this. This is where it gets to be kind of tender, is that you get to like understand that even though it's a complete mess and it's confused and it doesn't know what it's saying, he did this because it's like he feels a panic about humanity and mortality in particular. And I think he wanted to try to arrive at some kind of answers that were historically rooted, even if there might be some kind of something not very good in the logic of that, but I can at least I can see it, right? And again, his inscription of himself into the figure of Cicero. Ugh, I mean, it's a little bit puts too much optimism into Cicero as a figure, by the way. But also, just like he's trying to find some answers with this, but he doesn't offer us any solutions because, as we've talked about, Megalon is never explained. Like, it's not. There's no democracy to Megalon, right? Like, we can't reproduce it.
Yeah.
We can't even understand what it is, but it's supposed to solve our problems, which is again a metaphor for the film, right? Where we can't understand it, but
Mhm.
it's going to solve our problems.
Yeah, and not to mention it itself as this wonderful substance that can do all of these things can't actually be put to productive use for society unless you have a huge donor named Crassus
Yeah,
paying for it and bankrolling it,
right.
which is probably
Mhm.
where the Elon Musk ghostwriting aspect comes into this, right? Of like, I almost read it as like potential, like the potential of all of our creative and scientific endeavors for improving the future. And then at the end of the day, it's like, but that potential can never come to realization unless someone's bankrolling it.
Mhm,
And then there's these ne'er do wells that are trying to unbankroll it.
mhm.
And this again, like the kernel of an interesting idea is like I'm sure Coppola, as like a filmmaker for the last couple of decades, has an uncomfortable relationship with money and wealthy people. And in some ways, like when your art requires this much money, like film is not cheap.
Mhm.
And to do the kind of project you need requires tremendous amounts of money, and thus you become beholden and reliant, and or even just sort of involved with these, billionaires or mega rich people or powerful studios or whatever. And like I would imagine you maybe develop sort of conflicting feelings about how you interface with those people. Hence, we get the sort of again like the Crassus character played by John Voight, who feels like the opportunity for critical analysis,
Mhm.
but it's just kind of this weird benevolent, doddering old man who kills people at the end of the movie with
Oh,
his
yeah.
boner bow and arrow.
That was a fun scene at least.
Oh my god. That was the height or depth of that was the I was just cringing. That was really off
Yeah,
the rails stuff there.
and I
Yeah.
think people in my audience like didn't know how to read. Like there was, I think, a bunch of college age students behind me, and they just it was there was a laughter of like an uncomfortable nature of
Yeah.
like, is this supposed to be funny?
I think
Yeah.
that's true, is that the tone we had no the film didn't give us any clues as to how we were supposed to interpret this. Like, the film this is also one of the failures, is that you can dramatize difficult material if the film has an argument about it. But there's no contextual argument about those kinds of scenes, so we can't understand what the intent is or what the film feels about itself in those moments where we don't know whether we should be laughing or we should be in horror at the grotesquerie of it.
Right.
Mhm.
Again, my reference was not like any historical reference. It was Game of
Yeah,
Thrones,
I completely agree.
Tyrion
Mhm.
shooting his father on the toilet with a crossbow. Like, that's exactly what my mind went
I
to in
think that
that
is
scene.
the context. I think you're right, though. I think
Mhm.
that that's right because this also gets to the idea that Francis Ford Coppola, for him, historical periods are set dressings that can be in this context
Plastered over.
exactly like Game of Thrones has becomes a historical text that is mixed in with the Catalan conspiracy, which I'm not like inherently against, but it also creates like a confusing message in terms of interpretation. I did want to, by the way, like this statement you reminded us, Colin, about the end title card, or I guess the end card, whatever, of saying, for the human race, right? Is that like the racial politics of this film are egregious, and really like bad stuff, because it relates to this question of the alignment of whiteness with the Roman Empire, which is so pervasive within American culture. But also because, you have a Black Cicero, and this creates this kind of simulacrum of inclusivity. This is a concept from Lisa Lowe, and then this is also just a way for us to feel as if the film had done its due diligence, right? Which is relates to this prior point we're talking about, which is he thinks that he's being responsible, or he thinks he's being woke or whatever, to do these kinds of casting choices. But if you actually follow it to its logic, it creates like a kind of form of racial capitalism for the film itself. And we have a vast majority of white actors in the cast, and then also in these scenes where there are kind of spectacular, performances going on display. There's a scene where some performers come in and they're all Asian, and that's the only Asian people who are in the film. And you're like, okay, wait, hold up, right? Is this you having some appreciation for the complexities of race in antiquity, where you do have kind of stereotypes around race appearing in performance context, like for instance in Roman comedy, or in the in gladiatorial fights and things like that? Or are you actually not thinking about this at all and just reaching for stereotypes in order to populate the kind of scene making of your film? And I would rather kind of understand it to be the latter. And I think that it's something that must be spoken about this film, is that through the kind of positively an increased awareness of how contemporary race making is made through invocations of antiquity, in particular the Roman Empire, you have to come at this with a certain kinds of sensitivity. But the argument of this film is completely underdeveloped in this regard, and essentially it just presents a kind of white supremacist argument, actually.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and it's also like its timing is partially really poor too, considering Cicero as a Black man in this movie is representing the realistic law and order mayor or whatever of the city. My cat's going bonkers, sorry. And lo and behold, we have a Black mayor, Eric Adams, who's supposedly there on Law and Order.
We're just watching Chrissy's cat.
I know. I'm gonna have to keep her out here in a moment. I'm losing this battle right now. She wants out. So, but like, man, really poor timing. And then of course you have corruption charges coming on Eric Adams now and his institution. So it's like, I don't think that's Coppola's fault, but it sure makes this whole thing a lot more egregious at the same time.
I wonder if we should might cut this out, but for listeners, we're recording this basically a week before the election here in the United States. And like, are we going to feel differently about this movie on November 8th or 6th?
Oh, sure. Did Francis Ford Coppola make this film for this election? Is a question that we might ask ourselves.
I feel like
it felt like it, honestly, in some regards.
If so, wow, you whiffed. I mean, the aspect of a Black Cicero is really interesting, because the Cicero was invoked repeatedly over the course of the African American tradition, where, for instance, Frederick Douglass was hailed as a Cicero of the Black tradition by H. Cordelia Ray, and some of the kind of scholarship on classical use in African American context has done like a clausular analysis to show not precisely that he learned how to speak from Cicero, because that would be attributing too much agency to Cicero, but that he had a Ciceronian skill set and oratory that was part of a literally emancipatory project. And then you've got W.E.B. Du Bois, who also W.E.B. Du Bois explicitly invokes Cicero's Proarchia as he assents to the premise of the Proarchia as the defense of the poet Archias, as saying that a liberal education can achieve social uplift. And that is an example of how Cicero's works, which are themselves, we talked about his kind of patriarchal stance in the Catilinarian orations. We also have to remember that he is, to be a pater familias, to be the father of your household in antiquity, means to be an enslaver. as well. And so there is something quite uneasy in these invocations of Cicero as a bootstrapper from one social class to another, or like, let's say, towards emancipation. But that is, well, the burden of that is on Cicero rather than the Black authors who invoke him. And so I think it's quite insulting to the to the complexity of the African American reception of the Ciceronian corpus. You also have Anna Julia Cooper, by the way, who's a voice from the South, is a reconfiguration of Cicero's De Oratore on the Orator. And so there is, with Francis Ford Coppola coming in and kind of using, a tokenism essentially in order to make his film seem more progressive than it is, it would distract people from the fact that Cicero has a role to play, sometimes antagonistic, sometimes liberatory within the African American tradition. And it's real shame that we don't have, there's like no opportunity for that to be theorized in this, because you have, the kind of standard aspect of contemporary culture where you use people of color to become the authorities for the center, and you kind of assimilate them into to sanitize whatever messaging you have. This also relates to the fact that Ted Cruz once used the Catalanarians against Obama, and Ted Cruz's messaging in quoting the Catalanarians showed that he understood that Cicero and the Catalanarians was saying to Catalan, "I want to kill you." And like, there's a lot of the kind of tensions of this speech, which is the historical referent for the whole thing, like ostensibly, that are completely diluted to the point of nonsense in this film that is also, irresponsible, essentially. There's a lot of history behind this that could have been sensitively dealt with, that this film is an invitation to simply take less seriously,
Yeah.
And one other character I'll throw into the mix, in addition, sort of counter to Cicero, is Lawrence Fishburne, who is almost like approaching a like magical Negro stereotype in some ways. He's just kind of Catalina's driver, and he's the narrator, and he's just kind of there. And like, I thought for a second, again, maybe trying to overanalyze the allegory of like, is he supposed to be like Suetonius? Is he like cataloging all of this for posterity?
Yeah.
Like, what's going on?
Someone mentions being a historian, right?
It would be a Tiro figure to Cicero, where if that's the case, it would also be kind of fraught, let's say. But Lawrence Fishburne, beloved, amazing, and completely underused, not to mention put in incoherent positions here.
Yeah.
And also, who made his film debut in Apocalypse Now with Coppola as because the story is that the character is supposed to be like 16 years old, but Lawrence Fishburne was actually like 14 or 15 or something in the movie. Like he was one, like maybe too young to be in the movie. Like there might have been an age lying thing going on, but then he's supposed to be playing a young character. And so there could have been something even just meta film wise of like reuniting Fishburne and Coppola 50 years or not that long, whenever Apocalypse Now came out, decades later, and Lawrence Fishburne gets to be the driver and narrator.
Well, that makes sense of his presence there, which is, again, it's a kind of bag of mementos of Francis Ford Coppola's life, right? It's like all of these collected memories that are not actually cohering very well, and some of them are coming in and out of focus for him as he moves through this film.
I thought at some point someone claimed to be a historian, and I can't remember who that was.
I think it was Fishburne. He says,
That's
like,
what I thought.
I might have hallucinated this in a fever dream when I watched this movie, but he says something like, "I'm recording this all for my history" or whatever. But
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was in there.
Maybe it was like, maybe there's also so many parts about this film, because this had such a long gestation process that like feels like are like these like vestigial hangers on of like different versions of the film that may or may not have existed in the last 3 decades. And like, maybe there was a framing device of like, I am the historian reflecting back on this thing that I experienced. And we just get like little, fragments of that.
Yeah, I also, like, to me, the most shocking moment in the film was that night scene, and Adam Driver's character is in the car, and the little boy comes up to get an autograph from him, and, like, I kinda saw it as, like, something bad's gonna happen, and then, like, it's just very violent and abrupt, and I was kind of like, for a moment, it's like, "Oh, is the film just about over?" 'Cause, like, Catalan
Well,
Catalan
I,
dies, right? And I'm like, "Oh, good." And I'm like, "Nope, never mind. We're still in it for another 40
this is
minutes or
just like
so."
a case point where like a script doctor, because like so many times in this film, something happens that feels like it should be the central conflict or would be a big derailment, and it's immediately resolved in the next scene. Like the thing with the Vesta where
Oh
Claudia
yeah.
frames
Yeah.
Caesar for deflowering the Vestal Virgin, and then the next scene, a quick trip to the records library and the birth certificate vaults, and we find like, nope, not an issue. Caesar gets shot in the face. Maybe this will be an issue. Nope, Megalon can fix his face. Is he going to be permanently disfigured for the rest of his life? Not
Nope.
really, just the one scene.
Yep.
Oh,
So, anyways,
I
yeah,
couldn't even tell you what the central conflict of this film actually is because I don't know what the center is, and I don't like it would be, as you demonstrated beautifully, like it's hard to even give a plot summary for that reason. Is that what parts are really plot and what aren't? And everyone, this is the thing, is I think everyone felt like they were in a different movie, where they were acting in
mhm.
completely different ways. And it reminds me of an anecdote of like some director remarking upon an actor who was seemed to be doing not very much in front of the camera, and like in the room it felt like nothing, but then when you look at the footage it's like everything. It's like very subtle acting movements and things like that. And then I think the opposite is true of, for instance, Aubrey Plaza's character, where I think she thought she was doing great work on camera, but it's actually like very hard to watch. It's like it's badly contextualized. And Adam Driver thinks that he's in like a white genius movie and he has no idea what's happening
Mhm.
anywhere else. He really seems to have been kind of insulated where he didn't know what else was happening, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will say, like, my big takeaway from the movie was this conflict between idealism and realism.
Mm,
And when dreaming
Yeah.
of a future, what do we need? And in some ways that did speak to me in terms of what is happening to the humanities in colleges right now, right? Like so many humanities are losing funding, just being gotten rid of, and it's because we've had such a long emphasis on STEM, and it comes from the idea that STEM is where the jobs are. Those are like the big lucrative positions that you can get. It's the more realistic job in a lot of ways, and you lose the value of like, well, why do the humanities matter?
mm,
And I was teaching a class of medical humanities. I'm like, well, this is why it matters that your doctor should know how to have bedside manners and care about you as a human and be able to translate Greek and Latin medical terms into more layman terms for people to understand. But like, you don't go to medical school to learn those
mhm,
things, and it can actually dictate how good of a doctor you are to
mm,
people. And so the ending of the 2 of them getting together and the baby stopping time for a more hopeful future was kind of like this recognition of, like, we do need both in order to, like, step forward into the future. But it's like, but at the end of the day, that's just kind of a simple message with a lot of saccharine things in between to confuse you, and it still at the end of the day doesn't give you the steps of like, "But how do we do that?
mhm.
Get married?
Uh-huh.
Have a
Yeah.
baby?"
And it was just kind of like for me, I mean, again, we all might have been watching different movies, but my takeaway was Adam Driver was right all along. We should have been with him from the get
Yeah.
go, and we were wrong
Yeah.
to doubt him. And all you need is a really, evoke, persuasive, heartfelt speech to the masses, and then they'll come around on your vanity project or whatever it is.
Ugh, which is like a again putting too much optimism in Cicero. But the what is disappointing in light of your remarks, Christy, is that someone who should be representative of the humanities and the arts has actually given us STEM propaganda, which is that if you can figure out this one solution, then we'll all be, in a utopian society. And it's not going to be a collective effort. It's going to be your sole genius that does it.
Yeah.
It's a
Mhm.
bad message ultimately, and the way that Adam Driver's character is kind of cloistered away from society. Again, so go back to the club is said because he doesn't want to be bothered by women, I guess, but also just generally doesn't want to be bothered. He wants to be in his cell doing his work. It's a model of a solo white male genius that is not. There are so many people who are representing themselves like that right now, the Jeff Bezoses,
Yeah.
the Elon Muskses, and they're all very grim hoarders of resources, and they want to represent themselves as being philanthropists in some form, but they are certainly not acting like that. And so what is this message really? Like, we're supposed to be trusting this model. Again, it is fundamentally a patriarchal model. It is interesting to note how the tension, if you wanted to put the Catilinarian conspiracy really simply, the tension between Cicero and Catiline, which is a civilizational tension, even in antiquity, but is also something to do with the battle of elites over resources, is translated into this film as the reconciliation between elites towards the the solving of all of society's ills, but not through the
Yeah.
involvement of society, through its being pushed away to the edges of your focus.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think even visually we're kind of shown that in a way, because I like that you mentioned it's like he doesn't wanna go in the club and, like, hang out with the plebes, but, like, even in his office space, when shown to be working on this great Megalon project with other people, those moments are silent. Like,
Mhm.
they're having discussions. You don't get to hear what everyone else is contributing in that. Even Julia, who's like, "I wanna work with you," and you'll see her in those little office montages.
Mhm.
You don't get to hear what her ideas and thoughts are to contribute to bring Megalon into its full potential.
And again, what the are they even doing in those meetings? Because from us, it
Don't
looks like
know.
they're just goofing off, like they're just giving each other piggyback rides and playing with traffic cones.
That there's that scene where it's literal garbage that turns into like a digital fantasy, and I was like, this is just again a metaphor for the film. It's literal garbage that has had a lot of digital augmentation, which is also one of the reasons why it's ugly, is that there's so much of it which isn't real and it's just made in post, right? And but
Yeah.
it's true that those scenes just seemed like they're improving. And that's why, again, those are scenes that Adam Driver would have loved, because it's like, we're in the theater, we're doing a theater exercise now where we're climbing all over each other, over the garbage, and I'm, blah, blah, blah. You can see him
Yeah.
enjoying
Yeah, I'm a skyscraper. I'm a school. I'm an office
it.
building. Except we won't need schools because we'll be inspired to teach ourselves or whatever. It's just this
Yeah.
very, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like even in the few moments where they show that this is only possible through collaboration, it's that discussion is robbed its voice, like, literally.
Mhm.
And, the people being able to talk to each other and communicate ideas, and we don't do it anymore, right? Like, we go online, and there's enough people who go out there and have really weird handles and go and just trash what other people are saying, and it's so hard to actually hold a discussion. It's like, "Hey, we don't have to agree, but, like, you gotta do something better than ad hominem attacks and weird links that I don't wanna click because I'm afraid there's gonna be a virus on my computer at the end of the day."
Mhm. Mhm.
I have one possible like question for us to end on, but before I even think about pitching that, anything that we wanted to say that we haven't gotten out there yet?
We didn't talk much about costuming, but, like, the one that stood out to me at the very end was Aubrey Plaza's WoW Platinum. When she's shot, she is made to look like Cleopatra. She
Right.
has Medusa for her belt buckle, and the like, snakes are very much associated with her, and I'm pretty sure it's like because I was very hyper aware of that moment, there's hissing, like, you can hear snakes in that
Mhm.
moment, and it's so frustrating because it is true that, like, snakes were a really important figure for women in ancient Rome and beyond that, because it was a fertility symbol, and it is being used in this moment to, like, say, "No, she's a snake. She's the gold digger. She's got all these devious plans to get all the money," and, like, that's just it. You also just like, why does she want all the money? Just because? Like, she's arguably a very
But she'd give it
successful
all up to get
person.
back with
Oh my
Caesar too, is like
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh my god! And in that scene when they're in the street, and there's like a second shot where like like an item of clothing is dropped on the ground, and you see the car rolling over it, and then there's another shot that's like,
Yeah.
no, go run over it again. We need to see this thing being run over. It's like really strange, like bad editing in that
Yeah.
scene. Sorry, I just like
Yeah.
I'm getting all these flashbacks, like your recovered memories now. But no, this is precisely the point, is that those stereotypes regarding, for instance, Cleopatra are like can be traced to rhetorics from antiquity, but they were more complex in antiquity because they had a contextual history and they were put to political use. And here it's just like a little Halloween costume that you put on her, and then like, look, women bad, right? Great, solved it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we talk sometimes on this just show about how there's kind of two Romes that live in our sort of minds. There's like Rome that we could maybe start constructing from historical sources or archaeology or literature. And then there's also cinema Rome, and they're like related and closely in conversation with one another, but they're two separate entities kind of in a way. And I think this film kind of conflates the two, where there's many aspects of like the styling, the costuming, the theming, the whole idea that feels, while it's thinking about historical Rome and Catiline and Suetonius and Cicero and all that stuff, but is actually thinking more about the Liv Taylors and the Cleopatra, like that Cleopatra, or the Quo Vadises and the Spartacuses and the 50s, 60s sword and sandal films. And those two things are related and sometimes hard to sort of extricate from one another, but like they are separate entities in many ways.
Yeah.
And that's why you feel exhausted by this film, because you feel like you're just seeing things that you know very well, but in a poorer form, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was kind of the question I had going into it. Was like, I don't know if I expect anything new in the reception of Rome itself. And I was curious, is like, does that mean then it's going to be more focused on challenging what film is and being cutting edge in that way? And it's like, no, it just felt distracting to the fact that like all of the Rome stuff was like old and tired stuff.
Mhm.
I wondered if you guys noticed, because there every once in a while it seemed like he was doing something smart in there, and I don't know. During the Vesta performance, she had ads, and on those ads were a QR code,
Mhm.
which if you're in the theater, and my theater in particular was very vehement that you do not bust out your phone in here and distract people.
Oh yeah, Alamo will kick you to the curb if they catch you doing that.
Yeah, and so I'm like, he's literally created this thing where if I want more information in this film, because like, I don't know, I watched a lot of things that like ARGs and stuff where it's like you freeze frame things and you try and find the hints that are being incorporated into the media to get more information. I'm like, and here's a QR code just scrolling across the screen. And I'm like, do I pull my phone out and scan that to see what it says? And I couldn't
But
bring myself to do it because it was going to break theater etiquette. And I'm like,
is it going to take you to a page that says "You are the problem" or something?
exactly, and it's like, I kind of hate that I didn't do it, because it's like, okay, that might have been a weirdly smart thing to do, of throwing this new technology and information that people are programmed, like, it is a habit. If you see a QR code and you want the information that QR code could present, you pull out your phone and do it, and it's coming up against this older etiquette of you don't pull your phone out in the theater, and then you're kinda stuck there being like, "What do I do?"
That's fascinating, because obviously Martin Scorsese has had this whole thing about not watching films on your phone, right? And so there's this like,
Mhm.
is this Francis Ford Coppola thinking that he's being meta somehow in inviting? Oh God, yeah. Again, I feel a little bit more like that we've been able to uncover some strands of effortful,
Mhm.
thoughtfulness that didn't pan out. In addition to all of the mess, that's at least something optimistic.
Yeah.
We should also mention in like the final we didn't even get the full Megalopolis experience, because people at like Toronto and the TIFF Film Festival got like an interactive version where somebody like some kind of announcer like talked and had conversations with character in the film. There was actually like kind of like fourth wall elements for like certain screenings of this film, which
Hmm.
from most accounts I heard was weirdly executed and kind of
Well, I
awkward.
mean, I would die of cringe, I think. Ugh, yeah, it's kind of well, the issue, of course, is that it's now lost text because you can't see it anywhere, and I mean, presumably it will go to streaming as soon as possible because they'll try to make the money back. But
Yeah.
then you can pull out your phone and get the QR code.
Okay, listeners, if you get it, tell us what it leads to.
And don't send us anything bad.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, don't do that.
But yeah, I wonder if this film is going to become like, once it gets onto streaming or DVD or something, is it going to become like a cult object of like a point? Because it is like, my relation is, I am fascinated by this in a perverse way or something, where like I can recognize all of its many flaws that we just have spent the last hour and a half kind of going through, but also these kernels of interesting ideas, and it comes together in a thing that I can't look away from in some ways.
Well, you mentioned the at the film festivals, the, like, forced interaction, fourth wall, and, like, when you said that, it's like, I immediately think Rocky Horror Picture
Mhm.
Show, and that was the result of the community coming up around that media and creating this interactive aspect to it. So that was engineered by the audience, not by the creator, and I think that's what this film is gonna be really weird in the end because it's like, can it create a community of the audience if the creator wanted something very intentional with it?
Mm. It reminds me of films where the point of the film is to dramatize the bad behavior in it, but then people go like, let's say, Fight Club is supposed to actually be
Yeah,
Mhm.
commentary on
your
it,
Fight Club.
but then you have,
Mhm.
like very
Wolf
serious,
of Wall Street.
right, very serious young men who are like, no, I aspire to this lifestyle,
Mhm.
that's the danger. There's a real danger of that with this film, where
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I recently heard it expressed as fascination with the wrong
Mhm.
object. But
It leads you to a position where you can be quite dismissive of general audiences, right? Oh, they're not going to understand this well. But to be honest, this film does not present a critical framework for its own analysis. So it can only go straight into the bloodstream as basically like a white supremacist argument, right? Or a civilizationist argument, right? It can only do that
Yeah.
because it hasn't given you any critical framework for understanding it otherwise.
And the most accessible references are ones that already feed into that problematic aspect
Hmm.
to begin with.
all this to say is I genuinely wonder what Sofia Coppola thinks of this film. Although I don't know if she's been asked. I don't want to be the one to ask. I'm sure it's probably not
Like,
fun, but
was she
I'd be
happy to
very
see the
curious.
wineries go? Maybe that was, like, a side project she didn't care for, who knows? Well, much like having watched the film the first time, my brain hurts like a philosophy class, and I don't know what I take away from it in the other than a very pleasant conversation. So,
I
Yeah.
mean, you guys are so smart. I feel like I understand this a lot better. uh,
your review literally gave me a frame of reference because I read it, and then I watched the movie, and I was trying to articulate my thoughts in a way, and I read your review again, I'm like, "Okay, I agree a lot with what she's saying, and I feel a bit more cohesive in my own thoughts of what I thought of the film," because I think you just maybe it's genius. You have to talk about it to get any kind of
You
understanding
should
of
build a
it.
utopia.
I know. One of the things that I thought about when I was writing that blog post was that I had some responsibility to, as the classics professor studying it, to be more direct with what the references were. But at a certain point, I was like, this is actually not helpful. That is over reading the film because of its engagement with these texts, which again are Cicero himself and Sallust, are not that present in the film. And that's, again, I want to be really clear that in terms of what classical reception can do, you can start from quite a distant referent into making something quite profound. I just don't think that's what's happening in this context.
Yeah.
And so I think that if you're listening to this podcast, you made it all the way to the end. I mean, I think this is my advice to you is not to try to force a connection with the Catalan-Aryan orations or what have you, and just to recognize
Yeah.
that this is an artifact of unnuanced invocation of antiquity through the history of film that made it into a stereotype and also made it into just an unquestioned facade for great men, right? And this is back to Christy, I think your point that this is, or Colin, I can't remember. One of you said that there's a Shakespearean component to it.
Mhm.
Is that Shakespeare's invocation of antiquity as a backdrop to contemporary action is what I think Francis Ford Coppola thinks he has in mind here. But it is a beautiful demonstration of how our tastes have become more sophisticated and we become more critical of the media that we consume. And in that sense, it's also his vision is not optimistic to me. I find it very pessimistic. But our ability to reject his utopian image is making me feel optimistic because it redounds to our
Yeah.
own critical capacities and agency in response to the media that's presented to us as authoritative, right?
Yeah. That was
Mhm.
very well put.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. I'm not going to top that,
Mhm.
so we should probably call it right there.
So, special thanks, Hannah, for joining us this evening. I hope it provided you with that good opportunity to unpack this film. I'm really glad we invited you on because I don't know how else we would have tackled it. Colin would have been here
It would
by
have been
himself,
it
basically.
would have been me screaming at Christy for an hour and 30 minutes.
It's so if people would like to learn more about you, your work, where should they go? Where should they be checking out some of your projects and things like that?
Well, thank you both for having me. I needed to discuss this, and you two were like incredible interlocutors. And I'm really impressed with the conversation that we were able to have.
Well, wait till you listen back to
Okay,
it.
okay. And then, some things that I could plug. One is that Cicero is my actually author specialty. I wrote a book called Cicero and the Early Latin Poets that came out in 2022. I somewhat recently published an article about the Catalanarians, which is called "The Image of the Slave in the Catalanarian Orations" or something like that. And why that is pertinent is that I started to hear about the existence of this film while I was finishing up that article, whose argument is that Cicero creates a rhetoric on the premise of the disposability of enslaved people in that set of speeches, even though that set of speeches is used very euphemistically within like the Western tradition to be part of, the educated gentlemanly positionality, right? So that's another dynamic to this that we didn't even get to that would actually be quite fruitful probably. But my work nowadays, I have a collaborator called Matthias Hanses at Penn State. He and I are working together on another book now called Cicero and the Rhetorics of Race. And while I'm talking about Matthias, I should also plug his book, which will be coming out probably in the next year or so, which is on Cicero and W.E.B. Du Bois. So if you want to learn more about Cicero within the African-American tradition, you can go towards Matthias's work. And you mentioned at the top of the episode my work on Res Difficiles. This is an annual conference and also now open access journal that aims to address iniquity according to intersectional vectors in antiquity. So to speak about difficult topics which involve people's experiences within the field, as well as the difficulty which is inherent to these materials according to things like enslavement, gender, race, etc. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Of course.
Yeah, and I know you're on social media as well, so we'll be sure to post some links to that so people can follow your blog posts and things like that, because that's how we found you.
I am still on Twitter for my sins, and it's at Opietas Anime. You might as well just Google my name, actually, if you want to follow me. I'm not terribly present there anymore because of the collapse of civilization.
Yeah.
But I am still there. I'm there enough for us to have made this connection, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah.
And yeah, I can be found there, and also on Blue Sky.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right. Finally, special thanks to all you listeners. We could not produce episodes like this without your support. That being said, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe if you like what you hear so we can meet more amazing people and talk to them. You can find all our episodes at movieswedig.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know about our upcoming plans and episode releases, be sure to follow us on social media, where you can find us under the handle of @DigMovies or some variation of @MoviesWeDig. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye.